Professor David Mitchell had looked at thousands of photos from Nazi Germany. As a history professor at Columbia University who focused on World War II, his office walls were full of pictures from rallies, marches, and public events. But on a chilly October morning in 1991, while going through files from Hamburg State Archive, one photo made him freeze. The picture showed hundreds of ordinary workers gathered at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg on June 13, 1936. They had come for the launch of a training ship for the German Navy. Shipyard workers, dock laborers, foremen, engineers, and regular working men were all there for the ceremony. The scene looked normal for that time. A crowd of raised arms doing the Nazi salute, faces turned towards something beyond the frame, most likely a Nazi official or party leader. Line after line of the same gesture, a perfectly organized show of loyalty and obedience. David was about to move on when something caught his attention. He leaned closer under his desk lamp, staring at the grainy black and white image. In the center of the crowd, among all those stretched out arms, one man stood out. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. His face showed clear, stubborn displeasure. "That can't be real," David whispered. He had studied Nazi Germany for 23 years. He knew what happened to people who showed any public disagreement. People vanished for much smaller acts than refusing the Hitler salute. Yet here was clear proof of someone doing exactly that, caught in daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses at an official state event. David took out his magnifying glass and examined every part of the man's face and body. He was young, probably late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a plain worker's outfit, most likely a shipyard laborer or dockhand. His jaw was tight, his eyes looking somewhere far off. There was no sign of fear on his face, only quiet resolve. Around him, every other arm was raised. The difference was shocking. It was like someone had placed one act of rebellion straight into a picture of complete obedience. David's hands shook a little as he made a copy of the photo. This was not just another old document. This was proof of something very special. One regular shipyard worker who refused to give up his self-respect, even when surrounded by hundreds of co-workers doing the Nazi salute in perfect order. He had no clue who the man was, what became of him, or why he picked that exact moment to resist. But David Mitchell knew for sure that he would not stop until he learned the truth. The search had begun. David could not sleep that night. The image of the man with folded arms kept coming back to him. He had gone back to his Manhattan apartment with copies of the photo, spreading them out on his dining table, under strong lights, looking at every tiny detail. The more he looked, the more amazing it seemed. This was not a fuzzy or accidental shot. The photo was sharp, clear, and taken by a professional. The man's refusal was obvious and impossible to miss. How did this picture survive? Why didn't the photographer have to destroy it? How did the man himself survive what must have been serious punishment from Nazi officials, or even his own co-workers? By morning, David had filled 3 notebook pages with questions. He phoned his colleague, Dr. Rebecca Hartman, an expert in Nazi-era records at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. "Rebecca, I need your help," he said, sounding urgent. "I found something amazing." 2 days later, Rebecca sat in David's office, holding the photo with white archival gloves. She looked at it quietly for several minutes, her face changing from interest to surprise. "David, do you realize what this means?" she finally asked. "A man refusing the Hitler salute at a public event in 1936. "It's bigger than that," Rebecca said softly. "It's proof of personal resistance at a time when resistance could mean death. This is a regular worker at a shipyard ceremony, surrounded by hundreds of colleagues, all doing the Nazi salute. And he refused. This is truly remarkable. But we must check if the photo is real. We have to be completely sure it has not been changed or faked." They spent the next week doing technical tests. They checked the grain pattern, the lighting, the shadows, and the type of photographic paper. Every test gave the same result. The photo was original, untouched, taken in June 1936 at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg. Now the difficult part begins. Rebecca said, "We need to discover who he was." David contacted the Hamburg State Archive and explained his find. The archivist, a careful German historian named Dr. Klaus Brainer, was doubtful at first. But when David sent high-quality scans, Klaus called back quickly. "Professor Mitchell, this photo has been in our collection for many years," Klaus said in accented English. But no one ever noticed the man with folded arms. No one looked carefully enough. "You may have found something that stayed hidden in plain view for over 50 years. Can you help me learn his name?" David asked. "I will try," Klaus answered. "But it will not be simple. That shipyard had thousands of workers. Many records were lost in the war. And if this man was arrested or killed for his refusal, there might be no trace left." David felt a cold feeling run through him. The man in the photo had shown great bravery, but bravery in Nazi Germany often carried a heavy cost. "We have to try," David said firmly. "This man deserves to be remembered." The search took over David's life. He used every free minute studying Nazi-era work records, arrest papers, and deportation lists. Rebecca helped him, traveling between New York and Washington, working with archives all over Germany. Klaus searched hard in Hamburg, looking through old boxes of shipyard employment files that had survived the Allied bombings. 3 months later, they had names of hundreds of workers who were at the ship launch ceremony, but finding which one was the man in the photo was almost impossible. The picture was clear enough to show his defiant pose, but not sharp enough for certain identification without extra proof. Then Klaus found something important. Hidden in a filing cabinet in the basement of Hamburg's city archive was a police file from 1935. It described a man named August, who had received a warning from local police for Rassenschande, race defilement, the Nazi word for relationships between Jews and non-Jews. The file said he worked at Blohm & Voss, Klaus explained during a phone call with poor connection. "And there is a photo attached to his police record." David's heart beat faster. "Can you send it?" The copy arrived the next morning. David held it up to the light, then put it next to the shipyard photo. The face matched, the body shape matched, the age matched. "Rebecca, I believe we have found him," David said, almost unable to speak. August Landmesser. Over the next weeks, they put together the main parts of August's life. He was born in 1910 in a small town in northern Germany. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931, probably to get better work during the hard economic times. He worked as a laborer at the Blohm & Voss shipyard, but then the story became more difficult. Party records showed August was thrown out of the Nazi Party in 1935. The reason given was dishonoring the race through marriage to a Jewess. He fell in love with a Jewish woman, Rebecca said while reading the translated papers. In Nazi Germany, that explains why he stood there with arms folded. He had already lost so much. He had nothing more to lose. David felt deep sadness. This was not only a story of refusal, it was a story of love, of picking human connection instead of political obedience, of paying a huge price for refusing to hate. "We need to learn what happened to him," David said, "and we need to learn about the woman he loved." The search was no longer just for history. It had become personal. They were no longer looking for a name in a picture. They were looking for a man who loved so much that he risked everything. The woman's name was Irma Eckler. Finding details about her was even harder than finding details about August. Jewish records from Nazi Germany were incomplete at best, purposely destroyed at worst. But Rebecca's contacts at the Holocaust Memorial Museum opened important paths. Irma was born in 1913 in Hamburg, to a Jewish family. She met August in 1934, probably at a social event or through shared friends. By all accounts, they fell deeply in love. In another time, in another place, their romance would have been normal. But in 1935, Germany, their love became a crime. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in September 1935, officially banned marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. These laws turned private love into a public offense, making personal closeness an act of political resistance. August and Irma tried to marry anyway. David found their marriage application sent to Hamburg officials in 1935, officially denied with a stamp that said application rejected on racial grounds. They did not give up, Rebecca said, reading letters between August and different Nazi offices. He kept trying. He wrote letters, made appeals, argued with officials. He fought for her. In 1935, Irma became pregnant with their first daughter. They named her Ingrid. without legal marriage. Ingrid was labeled Mischling, mixed race. A child living in a dangerous legal space that would grow worse as Nazi rules became stricter. August's removal from the Nazi Party came soon after. He lost his party membership, his political rights, and faced more harassment from authorities. But he stayed with Irma. He refused to leave her, refused to abandon his daughter, refused to follow laws that ordered him to hate the woman he loved. In 1937, Irma gave birth to their second daughter, Irene. By then, August was watched closely. Police reports tracked his movements, his contacts, his continued living with a Jewish woman. Each report pulled the noose tighter. David found arrest records showing August was held several times between 1937 and 1938, charged with Rassenschande. Each time he was freed after weeks or months, warned, threatened, and sent back into a more hostile world. He always returned to her, David said, moved by the bravery this took. Every time they arrested him, he went straight back to Irma and his daughters. He chose love over safety again and again. Rebecca read witness statements collected after the war. There is a statement from a neighbor. She says August and Irma tried to escape Germany in 1938. They reached the Danish border but were sent back. They tried to flee together. The shipyard photo suddenly felt even heavier. That defiant pose, those folded arms were not just a quick action. They stood for years of resistance, years of choosing love over obedience, years of refusing to lose his humanity even as the world demanded it. But the papers also showed a painful truth. Their story did not have a happy ending. By 1938, Nazi attacks on Jews had grown much stronger. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, saw synagogues burned, Jewish shops destroyed, and thousands of Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. The trap was closing, and couples like August and Irma had fewer pal aces to hide. David learned that in 1938, August was arrested again, this time held for several months in Hamburg City Prison. When released, officials gave him a clear choice: stop all contact with Irma and their children, or face endless imprisonment. Records from the Social Welfare Office showed that while August was in prison, Irma struggled hard to care for Ingrid and Irene alone. Jewish families were losing their property, their jobs, their basic rights. Irma had no legal protection, no support, no means. A letter dated December 1938, written by Irma herself, was kept in city archives. In it, she begged officials to let August see their daughters. The letter was polite, respectful, desperate. My daughters ask for their father every day. They are innocent children. I beg you to show mercy. The answer was a stamped rejection. Request denied. Despite the warnings, despite the threats, August kept contact with his family. But by 1939, this became impossible. He was arrested again, this time sentenced to 2.5 years in a concentration camp for race defilement and refusing court orders. He was sent to Bergamo, Klaus told them, a harsh labor camp in northern Germany. He spent almost 2 years there before release in 1941. Meanwhile, Irma's life became terrible. In 1940, with August in prison, authorities took Ingrid and Irene and placed them in an orphanage. Irma fought hard to get them back, but as a Jewish woman without a legal husband, she had no parental rights. Rebecca found the orphanage records. They were painful. Notes from social workers described Irma visiting her daughters when permitted, bringing whatever little food she could get, holding them through the orphanage fence. The last recorded visit was in January 1942, Rebecca said quietly. After that, nothing. David knew what that meant. By 1942, the Nazi regime had moved from persecution to mass murder. Jewish families across Germany and occupied Europe were being rounded up and sent to death camps. He found Irma's name on a deportation list. On January 28, 1942, she was arrested in Hamburg and taken to Fuhlsbüttel prison. From there, she was sent to the psychiatric facility at Bernburg, which the Nazis used as a killing center under their euthanasia program. The record was cold and official. Irma Eckler, deceased February 1942. Cause: heart failure. That's a lie, Rebecca said with anger. Heart failure was the usual cover story. She was murdered, probably gassed or given a lethal injection. David sat quietly, filled with sorrow for people he had never met, but whose story had become part of his life. Irma had loved August. She had given birth to his children. She had suffered years of persecution, and in the end, she was killed by the same regime that August had quietly defied in that photo. But some pieces were still missing. What happened to August after release from Bergamo? And what happened to Ingrid and Irene, the two little girls who lost both parents? Following August's path after release proved very hard. By 1941, Germany was deep in World War II, and records became messy and incomplete. But David and Rebecca kept going, chasing every small clue. August was released from the concentration camp in January 1941, probably because the Nazis needed workers for the war. But he was a marked man, a former political prisoner, someone who had broken racial laws, considered unreliable. Klaus found work records showing August worked briefly at another Hamburg factory, but under close watch. He could not leave the city, had to report to police often, and was forbidden from contacting his daughters, who stayed in the orphanage. A witness statement from 1950, during post-war inquiries, came from a man named Heinrich, who worked with August in 1942. August never says "Oak" about his past, but once after work he asked me if I knew anything about the orphanage where his daughters were kept. He wanted to know if they were treated well. He was desperate to know they were safe. I said I would try to find out, but I never did. I was too scared. In September 1942, August was arrested again. This time the charge was trying to contact his children. The punishment was severe. Assignment to a military penal battalion, Strafdivision 999. These units were basically death sentences. They took political prisoners, criminals, and others seen as undesirable, sent them to the most dangerous parts of the Eastern Front with poor equipment and little training, expected to die in battle. David found August's military papers. He was sent to Croatia in early 1943, attached to a unit fighting Yugoslav partisans in the mountains. The conditions were cruel. Constant fighting, not enough supplies, surrounded by hostile people. Letters from August's commanding officer, kept in military archives, described a grim picture. The men of Strafdivision 999 get the most dangerous tasks. They clear minefields, do forward scouting under fire, and lead every attack. Casualties are very high. The last confirmed sighting of August came from a fellow soldier in the penal battalion, recorded in a post-war testimony. I saw August in October 1944, near the village of Huar. We were under heavy partisan attack. August was in the front position. There was an explosion, artillery, or a mine. I could not tell. When the smoke cleared, several men were gone. August was one of them. We never found his body. August was officially listed as missing in action in October 1944. He was 34 years old. He never saw his daughters again after they were taken in 1940. He never knew Irma had been murdered 2 years earlier. David sat at his desk, staring at the photo that started everything. The man with folded arms, standing defiant among a sea of raised salutes, had lost everything. His love, his children, his freedom, and finally his life. He never gave in, David said quietly to Rebecca. Even at the end, forced into a penal battalion, sent to die far away, he never gave up who he was. But the story was not finished. Somewhere, Ingrid and Irene had survived, and they deserved to know what their father had given up for them. Finding Ingrid and Irene was the most emotional part of the search. After the war, thousands of children were lost, orphaned, or separated. Tracking two specific girls through that confusion needed patience, luck, and contacts across many organizations. Rebecca made the key discovery. Working with the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany, an archive for Nazi victims, she found records showing Ingrid and Irene were moved from the Hamburg orphanage to different foster families in 1943. They were separated, Rebecca told David over the phone, her voice heavy. The Nazis decided to place them with different families, probably to make them easier to absorb, to erase their Jewish background and their connection to each other. Ingrid, the older daughter born in 1935, went to a family in rural Bavaria. Irene, born in 1937, went to a family in Lower Saxony. Neither family told the girls the truth about their parents. Both received new identities and were told their parents had died in the war. Post-war records showed Ingrid grew up never knowing her real last name. She was told she was a war orphan, nothing more. She married in 1954, had children, lived a normal life in Munich. She never knew her father was the man in the famous photo. She never knew her mother had been murdered. She never knew she had a sister. Irene's life was similar. She grew up believing she was the real daughter of her foster parents. She became a teacher, married, settled in Bremen. Like Ingrid, she lived her whole adult life without knowing the truth. They lived 50 years without knowing who they really were, David said, overcome by the sadness. Their father died trying to protect them. Their mother was murdered, and they never knew. But in the late 1980s, things started to change. Germany began facing its past more openly. Archives opened. Researchers dug deeper. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and documents from East Germany became available. Klaus discovered that in 1990, a German researcher named Professor Wolfgang Scheffler was looking into Nazi labor camp records and found August's name. Following the trail, Scheffler found the orphanage records showing Ingrid and Irene's placement. Scheffler made it his goal to find the daughters and tell them their real history. After months of searching, he located Irene in Bremen. In 1991, the same year David found the photo, Scheffler contacted her. David got a copy of Scheffler's notes from that first meeting. Irene was 54 when she learned the truth. She had lived her whole life as someone else. Now she suddenly learned she had a Jewish mother who was murdered, a father who defied the Nazis and died in a penal battalion, and a sister she never knew about. She was shocked, Klaus told David, but also angry. Angry that she had been lied to for 50 years. Angry that her parents were taken from her. Angry that no one tried to tell her sooner. Scheffler helped Irene find Ingrid. The two sisters met for the first time since they were small children. They were strangers, yet linked by blood, by loss, by a shared past they were only now starting to understand. Ingrid was quieter than Irene, more reserved, but the feeling in her eyes when she saw the photo was clear. All my life I felt like I did not belong, Ingrid said softly. Now I know why. I came from love that was forbidden. I came from pair, NTS, who chose each other over everything. I came from courage. The three of them stood together looking at the photo that had revealed so much. The man with folded arms was no longer unknown. He was August. He was a father. He was someone who loved deeply enough to defy a whole regime. Thank you, Irene said to David. Thank you for finding him. Thank you for making sure he is remembered. But David knew the story could not stop there. The world needed to hear about August Landmesser. His bravery deserved to be known. After meeting Irene and Ingrid, David went back to New York, determined to share August's story widely. This was not just a small detail in history. This was a strong example of personal resistance, of the bravery needed to choose love and dignity over obedience and hate. He wrote an article for the Journal of Modern History, describing the discovery of the photo and the long search that followed. He included interviews with Irene, statements from people who knew August, and thoughts on why this image mattered. The article came out in the fall of 1992, and the reaction was fast and strong. Newspapers across America covered the story. The New York Times ran a front-page feature. Time magazine printed the photo with the headline, "The Man Who Said No, Discovering August Landmesser." Television channels wanted interviews. Documentary makers wanted to tell the story, but David insisted the focus stay on August and his family, not on the American professor who found the photo. "This is not my story," David told reporters. "It's the story of a man who loved a woman they told him he could not love, and who refused to hate when the world demanded it. That's what people need to understand." The photo itself became famous. It was shown at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, with a sign explaining August's story. It appeared in history books, in Exhibit S, about resistance to Nazism, and in films about the Holocaust. Schools across America started teaching about August Landmesser. Students looked at the photo, talked about what courage means, and asked if they would have the strength to stand alone in a crowd of obedience. Irene and Ingrid, who were shy about public attention at first, slowly came to see the power of their father's legacy. Irene especially began speaking about remembering personal resistance. "People always ask, 'What would I have done?' Irene said during a talk at the Holocaust Museum in 1994. "My father answered that question. He was an ordinary man, a worker, not a politician or thinker. But when the moment came to choose between obedience and conscience, he chose conscience. That choice cost him everything. But it also meant his children could grow up knowing their father was a man of honor." The story touched people strongly in America, where talks about civil rights, obedience, and personal resistance had their own difficult history. August became a symbol that went beyond his time, a reminder that regular people in any era might have to make huge choices. Academic meetings studied the photo. Psychology teachers used it to explain conformity and group pressure. Ethics classes discussed the duty individuals have to resist unfair systems. But for David, the most touching responses came from regular people. He received hundreds of letters from across America, from students, teachers, veterans, immigrants, people who saw in August's folded arms a mirror of their own fights to keep dignity in hard times. One letter from a black woman in Birmingham, Alabama, touched him deeply. "My grandfather took part in the bus boycott in the 1950s. He lost his job, faced threats, was arrested many times. When I saw August Landmesser's photo, I saw my grandfather. The situations were different, but the bravery was the same. Thank you for showing the world that resistance is possible, even when it seems impossible." August Landmesser's story had gone beyond history and become something for everyone. A powerful example of the strength of personal conscience against collective madness. 25 years after David first saw the photo in 2016, Irene stood at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg, the place where her father once worked, where he stood with arms folded in quiet resistance, had changed a lot. The big cranes and factory buildings were still there, but everything around them looked different. She was 79 years old now, a grandmother, her life full of family and moments her parents never saw. Ingrid had passed away 2 years earlier, but her children came to the event, wanting to honor the grandfather they never met. The city of Hamburg had decided to make a memorial, not a large statue, but something simple and strong, a bronze plaque set in the ground at the exact spot where August stood on June 13, 1936. Irene read the words aloud, her voice calm despite the feeling. "August Landmesser, 1910–1944. He stood here and refused. His courage reminds us that personal resistance is always possible, even in the darkest times of history." Around her stood her children and grandchildren, city officials, local students, and survivors of Nazi persecution from different parts of Germany. David had flown in from New York, now retired but still deeply connected to August's story. "My father was not a hero who planned to change the world," Irene said to the crowd. "He was a man who fell in love, when the world told him that love was illegal, that it was shameful, that it was wrong. He refused to listen. He chose love. He chose his family. He chose to stay human when the world demanded he become a monster." She paused, looking at the photo that had been enlarged and placed on a nearby wall. The same image David found 25 years before, the man with folded arms, standing alone in a sea of obedience. "For 50 years, I did not know who my father was. I did not know my mother. I did not know my sister. The Nazis took everything from us, our parents, our identity, our history. But they could not take away what my father stood for. They could not erase his refusal. That photo survived. The truth survived. And now, finally, his courage is honored." A young German student, about 16, raised her hand shyly. "What do you want people to learn from your father's story?" she asked. Irene smiled softly. "I want them to learn that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. My father was not a politician or an officer. He was a shipyard worker. But when the moment came to choose between safety and conscience, he chose conscience. And I want people to know that those choices are never easy. My father paid a terrible price. My mother paid a terrible price. But they never gave up who they were." She looked at her grandchildren, seeing in their faces the continuation of August and Irma's legacy, a legacy the Nazis tried to wipe out, but which survived against all odds. Every generation faces moments when they must choose between obedience and resistance, between going along and having courage. My father's photo reminds us that individuals matter, one person standing with arms folded in a crowd of thousands. It seems so small, so unimportant, but that gesture spread across time. It inspired people I never met, in places my father never knew. His refusal became a symbol of hope. David stepped forward to the memorial and placed a white rose on the plaque. August Landmesser showed us that love is resistance, he said quietly. In a world built on hate, choosing to love someone they told you to hate is revolutionary. In a system that demands obedience, keeping your humanity is defiance. The ceremony ended, but people stayed, looking at the photo, reading the plaque, taking pictures to share with friends and family everywhere. August's story would keep spreading, keep inspiring, keep challenging people to ask themselves, what would I do? Would I have the courage to stand alone? As Irene walked away from the shipyard, her grandchildren beside her, she felt something unexpected: peace. For 79 years, she had lived with questions about her parents, with empty spaces in her identity, with the pain of being separated from everything she should have known. Now, at last, she understood. Her father was August Landmesser, the man who said no. Her mother was Irma Eckler, the woman who loved him despite the world's hatred. And she, Irene, was the living proof of their courage, their love, their refusal to give in. The photo would always be a frozen moment from 1936, a man standing alone with arms folded. But its meaning would keep growing, reaching across decades and countries, reminding every generation that resistance starts with one person choosing conscience over obedience, love over hate, dignity over fear. August Landmesser never knew his defiant stance would be caught on camera. He never knew that image would survive. He never knew that 70 years later his daughters would learn his story and the world would honor his courage. But in that moment in 1936, standing in the Hamburg shipyard with arms folded while hundreds around him raised their arms in salute, he knew he could not give up who he was. And that knowledge, that choice, that single act of refusal became his lasting gift to everyone who would come after.